Did you know that Bilbo wasn't actually present for the Battle of the Five Armies? Well, not mentally. You see, he actually got knocked out partway into the battle. Literally, a rock hit his head and it was lights out for our little hobbit. Now I know technically in the movie he gets knocked out as well, but it's a lot different. So is what we see in the movie actually accurate? We get an hour-long sequence of scenes showing this epic battle, but is it all a lie? Well, in today's video, my goal is to help fill in some of those gaps by comparing these scenes in the movie to their corresponding pages in the book, finding every change, revision, and omission along the way. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 12 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, the Hobbit Edition. Thanks for tuning in to Factor Fantasy, a channel dedicated to the Lord of the Rings and all things Tolkien. If you enjoy breakdowns of Tolkien's greatest works and their adaptations, subscribe as I create new videos each and every week. Also, like and share with a Tolkien-loving friend, as that greatly helps to grow this community. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's briefly refresh our memories on what happens in Peter Jackson's version of this epic battle. So, picking up from where we left off in the last episode, we see Bilbo leave the mountain to take the Arkenstone to Thranduil and Bard. He also reunites with Gandalf, who is trying to give counsel to the Elven King and the Dragon Slayer, but they won't listen. We then see the elves and the men come up to the mountain the next day and present the Arkenstone to Thorin, saying they'll give it to him in exchange for him holding up his end of their original bargain. Thorin gets angry at this, and after finding out that Bilbo gave the stone to them, he nearly throws the hobbit from the ramparts. Gandalf intervenes and stops him before he can, which allows Bilbo just enough time to scramble down from the gate and join forces of the elves and men. Unfortunately, Dain and the dwarves from the Iron Hills show up, which starts a fight. But before they can battle for too long, some massive worms burst through the earth and the goblins arrive. We then witness the dwarves and elves band together to fight their common enemy, and I won't go into the details, but we essentially see an hour-long battle sequence. During these scenes, we see Thorin overcome his dragon sickness and lead his company onto the battlefield, rallying the dwarves of the Iron Hills. Also, we see Bard protecting his people and children in the city of Dale, and Alfred dying a humiliating death. Then, to wrap it all up, Thorin and some of the others decide to confront Azog, who is on top of Raven Hill. Once they get there, they find that it's a trap, and Fili and Killy die, leaving Thorin to battle Azog alone. Thorin fights the final boss and ultimately loses, as although he defeats Azog, he dies in the process. Which personally, I blame physics for this one. I mean, how was Thorin supposed to know that Azog was a waterbender? Anyway, that wraps up our scenes that we're covering today, which most likely means that our next episode will be our last one. But as for today's episode, let's jump into our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. These categories are pretty simple this week, as it's a lot of the same things I've been saying in almost every episode of the series. First of all, for characters, Legolas, Tauriel, Azog, and Alfred are all made up for the story. Obviously, Legolas and Azog are real Tolkien characters, but Azog was long dead by the time this story takes place. Bolg, who is shown in the movies, is Azog's offspring and is the main boss in this journey. Additionally, if you remember from last episode, we meet a raven named Roak, who is the chieftain of an ancient race of ravens that help Thorin deliver messages to Dain. He comes back in these chapters, but in the movie we only see a raven, it doesn't speak, and we never learn its name, and the entire backstory of this relationship is omitted. As for timeline and location, we have the usual change that the scale of the mountain and the city are not as realistic in the movie. They weren't as close together, and it was quite a journey to walk from one to another. Obviously, for the sake of the movie, it was more convenient to show them right next to each other, just a quick jog back and forth, but it wasn't like that in the book. Plus, a little timeline issue is the fact that Dain doesn't show up until the day after Thorin rejects the offer from Bard. The dwarves from the Iron Hills do not show up as the Elven army are outside the mountain, but we'll get more into that in the plot changes. Before we get there though, I wanted to give a huge shout out to Jason, Joshua, Timothy, Robo Steve, and the rest of my incredible Patreon and YouTube members who help make these videos possible every month. Also, if you're wanting to relive Bilbo's epic journey all over again, or perhaps for the first time, I highly recommend checking out the audiobook on Audible. I have a link in the description that gets you one audiobook for free, and it supports the channel at the same time. So go ahead and claim your free trial today and start listening to The Hobbit or any other book of your choice. Now with that being said, let's jump into the plot changes. I need to say up front that many of you warned me when I started the series that doing The Hobbit would probably drive me insane, but still I packed my things up, left the comfort of my Hobbit hole, and journeyed into the wilderness. Along the way, we have run into many foes and faced them all, but today our adventure comes to a head as we face our biggest foe yet, the Battle of the Five Armies. And I don't mean the movie, I mean the battle itself. It's important for me to tell you now that essentially everything that happens in this sequence is completely incorrect. That being said, I'm almost certain that I've missed some things. I usually try to point out all of the little details and differences, but because everything is so drastically screwed up, I probably forgot to add something here or there. But anyway, to make things easier, we're just going to follow Tolkien's order of events that he documents in chapter 16 and 17 of The Hobbit. Chapter 16, which is titled A Thief in the Night, is all about Bilbo delivering the Arkenstone to Bard, and the following chapter, titled The Clouds Burst, tells us about Dane's arrival and the little information we get about the battle itself. So, starting with chapter 16, our first change here is the omission of Roach the Raven. And not just Roach, but the ravens as a race in general. You see, the chapter picks up by telling us that multiple days had passed, and during those days, Thorin and the dwarves were seeking the Arkenstone. Of course, Bilbo already has it, but they just don't know that yet. That is not the change, because of course that is in the movie, but what we don't get is when Roach returns from delivering news to Dane. He comes back to Thorin and tells him that Dane and about 500 dwarves should be about 2 days away now. Roach, who's over 100 years old and very wise, then tells Thorin that this will most likely end in death for all of them. He says that winter is not far away, and even if they win in battle, which they most likely won't, they'll probably starve without the aid of the elves and men. But Thorin, who is thoroughly in the grips of dragon sickness by this point, cannot see reason, and he is determined to fight his way out of this mess. After this, we return to Bilbo, who, after much thinking, has decided on a plan. He wants to give the Arkenstone to Bard. However, he first needs to get past the Night Watchman, which is our next change as the movie gives this role to Bofur. For some reason, they turned Bofur into a key character in the movie, but in the book it's actually Bombur. Bombur in the book has quite a few speaking parts, unlike the movie, and in this chapter he is cold and tired and doesn't want to be on night watch. So Bilbo comes up and says that he'll cover his duty for the night, and then uses the opportunity to leave and head to Dale. And that brings up another change, as in the movie we see Bilbo appear in Thranduil's tent that night, but in the book he actually is caught by elven guards, although he kind of lets them catch him. Something that isn't super clear in The Lord of the Rings, as it is in The Hobbit, is the fact that even with the ring on, people can still hear you, and that's what happens to Bilbo. He accidentally falls into some water as he is heading to Dale, and hidden elves pop out at the sound, but they don't see anything. Bilbo, who is hiding behind a rock at this point with the ring on, sneezes. This sneeze is what gives him away, and he even hears the elven guards guess that it's probably the dwarves' servant who helped free them from the king's palace. Bilbo then willingly removes his ring and allows them to capture him. He then demands to be taken to Bard, and a couple of hours later he gets his wish. Next, this was actually a scene from the last episode, but it kind of has to do with these scenes as well, because we see Gandalf with Thranduil and Bard. Technically, Gandalf had not revealed himself yet to anyone, and was pretending to be an old man in the city. He didn't warn Bard or Thranduil about the goblins coming to attack them, and if he did, Bard and Thranduil would have taken him seriously. This is another thing that I'll touch on later, but the movies really made Thranduil seem like a jerk when in reality, he definitely would have listened to Gandalf. Thranduil may have been proud, but he wasn't an idiot. For example, another change we have here is a small one, but goes to show Thranduil's kindness, and that is the fact that after Bilbo hands over the Arkenstone, he says that he is going to return to the dwarves. Thranduil can see that this is dangerous and unwise, and offers for Bilbo to stay. He says that Bilbo is more worthy than many elf princes to wear the elven armor that he has on, meaning his mithril, and he says that they'll take good care of him if he decides to stay. But Bilbo, being loyal to Thorin, says that he must return. I think they kind of gave this to Gandalf in the movie in order to maintain Thranduil's snooty attitude, but in the book, Gandalf simply reunites with Bilbo as the Hobbit is leaving and heads back to the mountain. He is an old man and reveals himself and says that something is coming that nobody knows about, and that's that. Also, technically Bilbo gives the Arkenstone to Bard specifically, as that is who he trusts the most. Plus, it was with Bard and his people that they made a deal. They never made a deal with the elves. And the last change for this little meeting in the night is the fact that the movie omitted Bilbo's key piece of information that he shares with Bard and Thranduil. You see, Bard is the one who's more willing to let the dwarves starve. He is much colder in the book. But Bilbo tells them that Dain is coming with about 500 dwarves. That piece of information, plus the Arkenstone, is what prompts Bard to go and try to make a deal with Thorin. So after this meeting and seeing Gandalf and Dale, Bilbo is escorted back to the mountain where he sneaks back in without any of the dwarves knowing what he did. And that is where chapter 16 ends. But believe it or not, that only accounts for about 25% of our changes this week, because chapter 17 is where Peter Jackson had most of his issues. To start, there isn't a whole army outside the mountain as Bard and Thranduil present the Arkenstone to Thorin. In the book, a messenger comes and requests a parley with the dwarves. Thorin agrees, but says that they need to come few in number and unarmed. So later, Thranduil and Bard show up with only about 20 people, and they lay down their weapons before coming to the gate. Then, much of what we see in the movie here in this meeting is similar to the book. The Arkenstone is revealed, Thorin gets angry with Bilbo, and Gandalf reveals himself and Bilbo escapes. But our next change is something the movie didn't do, which is have Thorin agree to their terms. He tells them that they were right to think he would bargain for the Arkenstone because it is that precious to him. So he says that he will fulfill Bilbo's contract and give 1/14 of the treasure to them in exchange for the Arkenstone. Bard then says that they have until noon the next day to present the treasure, and then the stone will be theirs. Now, a little side note here is that Thorin agreed to this deal, but in his own mind, he was already thinking about ways that he could get out of it. He thought that maybe when Dain arrived, they could take the Arkenstone by force. So this promise wasn't 100% truthful. And speaking of Dain, that brings us to our next change, which is all about his arrival and the start of the battle. No, Dain doesn't arrive during the meeting. Like we already mentioned, the whole elven army wasn't outside the mountain anyway. So it wasn't as climactic as the movie shows. In typical Tolkien style, it was much more realistic per usual war customs. The day after the meeting, Dain and his people arrived, as they had marched through the night to get there faster. They sent messengers to speak to the Elven King and Bard, and essentially they say to get out of the way or else. And upon Bard and Thranduil's refusal, the dwarves prepare to attack. Now this brings me to a change regarding Thranduil that I teased earlier, and that is the fact that Thranduil is a lot nicer in the book. He does not have some strange vendetta against the dwarves. If anyone is harsh, it's Bard, who is way more willing to fight. Remember, he was the captain of the guard in Lake Town, not some peaceful bargeman. Thranduil, though, in Tolkien's typical elvish style, doesn't like death. This is what we read after Dain's messengers leave the presence of Bard and the Elven King. "Fools," laughed Bard, "to come thus beneath the mountain's arms. They do not understand war above ground, whatever they may know of battles in the mines. There are many of our archers and spearmen now hidden in the rocks upon their right flank. Dwarf mail may be good, but they will soon be hard put to it. Let us set on them now from both sides before they are fully rested." But the Elven King said, "Long will I tarry ere I begin this war for gold. The dwarves cannot pass us unless we will, or do anything that we cannot mark. Let us hope still for something that will bring reconciliation. Our advantage in numbers will be enough if in the end it must come to unhappy blows." So as you can see, this is literally polar opposites to the movie characters. In fact, in an earlier scene when Bard tries to speak to Thorin, he stops Thranduil from just going and attacking right then and there. And then when he returns, he is super unhappy that Thorin won't listen, and he seems to despise the idea of war. Whereas Thranduil has a look in his eyes as if he relishes the opportunity to kill the dwarves. The movie version of these two characters is just weirdly out of place. It is not in the peaceful nature of the elves to be this violent. As you can see by what Thranduil says in the book, the last thing he wants is blood to be shed over gold. But anyway, moving on to the fight itself, we read about the battle commencing as eventually it does come to unhappy blows, with the dwarves making the first move. The dwarves and the elves are just about to collide when Gandalf jumps in the middle of the battlefield and shouts for them to stop. Right at that moment, they can see a dark cloud quickly coming towards them, and Gandalf points out that it is Bolg and a goblin army, coming with bats in the sky. Plus, the wargs have teamed up with the goblins. Thus, we get our 5 armies: elves, men, dwarves, goblins, and wargs. For some reason, Tolkien doesn't acknowledge the bats as their own army, so maybe they aren't sentient like the wargs are. Anyway, with Gandalf's prompting and a new common enemy, the dwarves, elves, and men all team up against this new foe, and the battle begins. With that, let's do a quick lightning round of additions Peter Jackson made for the movie. First, there are no giant dune worms. Second, there's no subplot of Bard and his kids and Dale. Third, there's no subplot of Alfred dying a humiliating death. Fourth, there's no subplot of Tauriel and Legolas fighting Bolg. And fifth, there's no subplot of Thorin fighting Azog. Azog isn't in the story, and Thorin dies a normal death in battle, killed by regular goblins. Now let's slow it down slightly and talk about what we do read. We do get some description of the battle as the goblins started to overtake the allied forces. We read that the elves attacked first, but then they were supported by the dwarves soon after. We learn about goblins trying to scale the mountain. We also read that Bilbo put his ring on quite early in the fight and disappeared. Although it didn't protect him from being physically harmed, it did mean that he couldn't be specifically targeted by a goblin. The day drew on and the battle raged for hours, and eventually Thorin and his company emerged from the mountain. We never learn about what happened inside the mountain, but I'll just assume that something similar to what the movie shows took place, with Thorin finally coming to his senses and joining the battle. Bilbo witnessed the battle go on and on for quite some time, as he stood on Raven Hill where he had a good vantage point with some other elves. Raven Hill was also the best place to escape should one need to. But he was still invisible, and the goblins had begun to throw rocks down from the mountainside. Thankfully, right as the battle looked like the men, elves, and dwarves had lost, Bilbo looked in the distance and saw what was unmistakably an eagle. That's when he shouted, "The eagles, the eagles!" But before he could see them arrive, a rock hit his head and knocked him out cold. Technically, I do want to mention that the movie incorporated a version of this as Bolg knocks Bilbo out after he arrives with reinforcements. But before being knocked out in the movie, Bilbo is quite involved in the battle, even killing some goblins and delivering news to Thorin and the rest of them. And that is the main thing that's incorrect. In the book, Bilbo does nothing other than just watch, and then he gets knocked out and missed most of the battle. Despite Bilbo being knocked out, we learn in the next chapter about the remainder of the fight as some people fill in the gaps for him. I'm not going to talk about the next chapter just yet, as we'll cover that in our final episode, but I will use some of the parts of that chapter to help us finish up with what we know of the Battle of the Five Armies. For starters, the eagles didn't fly Beorn to the battlefield like the movie shows, but Beorn did arrive and he was the one who saved the day, which is our next change, as in the book, Beorn is the one who kills the leader of the goblins, Bolg. Of course, I can see things from a movie perspective. Why would you give the climactic resolution of the battle to Beorn when you could have Thorin himself do it in his dying moments? After all, Thorin is pretty much the main character, and Beorn is just a supporting act. But as I've discussed on this channel before, Tolkien often gave really crucial moments to side characters who only appear for a few pages. It's a lot more realistic because if you really think about it in real life, it's not like one person gets all the glory. It's usually spread out across multiple people. But that doesn't do well on film because you really want the focus to be on the main characters. Tolkien, however, didn't care about that, and he used any characters he wanted for any purpose at all. And in this instance, it was Beorn who finished off the leader. But anyway, next, with Bolg dead, the goblins fled, and the men, elves, and dwarves chased them down in the valley and killed them all. Also, just on a general note for the battle, there were no crazy war machines or different types of trolls. That was such an insane addition for the movie, to not only have trolls there, but to have different types of trolls. You had the ram troll, the catapult troll, the regular grunt troll, the blind paraplegic troll, and much more. Not only is this ridiculous in general, but also, how did this blind troll find its way up onto Raven's Hill? Plus, I get that it was a slightly cloudy day, but don't trolls turn to stone in the sun? Seemed like quite the plot hole to have the enemy's greatest weapons be a race that literally can't fight during the daytime, which is probably why in Tolkien's version, they weren't there. Also, not to nitpick, but if you have massive worms that can eat through stone like butter, why not have them attack? They literally make a path for Azog and his army, and then they just dip. They could have cleaned up the Free Peoples in seconds. Anyway, I gotta stop myself before I go off on too long of a tangent there. Our next change is the fact that Fili and Kili died defending Thorin. Azog isn't in the story, and Bolg isn't trying to wipe out the line of Durin. There isn't a specific plan formulated just to kill Thorin and his family. They're simply overpowered by many goblins, and the two younger dwarves lay down their lives to shield their king and uncle. And now to wrap things up, our last change is that after Bilbo wakes up, he is found by a random soldier who is sent to look for him by Gandalf. Thankfully, Gandalf knew of Bilbo's ring and made them look very thoroughly, as it was possible for him to be invisible. Then, after getting back down to base camp, Thorin requests to see Bilbo, and they make their peace with each other as Thorin takes his last breaths. This is similar to the movie, except for the fact that they're not alone in the book, and Thorin is not dying because of Azog. He's dying because he just got stabbed a bunch. And that pretty much wraps up all of the changes for the battle. Like I said, there are probably dozens more, as you could nitpick these scenes all day, but I think I covered the main ones that pertain to the book itself. If you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe and share with a friend. Check out the playlist linked in the description to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far, and give yourself a pat on the back for being part of this journey, as we're only one episode away from being done. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.